Well, Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale says every level of government is pulling together to help flood victims across the country. Goodale defended Ottawa's handling of the crisis, saying the first-line response is the responsibility of the municipalities. But he emphasized that the federal government has also stepped in. Hundreds of Canadian soldiers are in the flood zone, but there's been some criticism from people in Quebec that the help was late in arriving. A reporter asked whether these floods might prompt governments to take a second look at the protocols around calling in the military, given that right now provinces have to make the initial request. Here's Goodale's response.
The first line of responsibility, authority, and jurisdiction clearly rests with municipalities and with provinces. And the federal government's role is to respond and to respond quickly whenever requests are made, and we have done that. In the case of the request from Quebec, I think it took exactly 30 seconds for the answer to come, and the answer was yes, and the same in the case of Ontario. I will be meeting later this month with all of the provincial and territorial emergency planning and emergency measures ministers. And part of what we're looking at is the overall policy framework for the management of disasters and emergencies of all kinds. So that review is actually already underway. But I think it is very important to recognize that the jurisdictional authorities need to be respected. We will examine whether the present procedure and protocol is appropriate in all circumstances, but all ministers have been anxious to have a new framework with an effective strategy. But I would say this as well. In each province and in many municipalities, there is a very effective professional emergency management team and system locally. They do remarkable work. They are very professional people, and they are the best place to make the judgment calls that need to be made rather than a dictate coming down from on high. So we need to find the right ways to work together and make sure we're all sharing all of the necessary relevant information.
That was Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale speaking today here in Ottawa. While politicians are talking disaster response, my next guest wants people to spare a thought for prevention, including the role of governments. Glenn McGillivray is the Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. That's an independent research institute established by the insurance industry to look at disaster loss prevention. We've reached Glenn McGillivray in Toronto. Hello.
Hi.
So what's been going through your mind as you've been watching the coverage of flooding in Quebec and Eastern Ontario?
Unfortunately, it's kind of a deja vu all over again type of feeling I'm getting. We see flooding in Canada pretty much every spring. It's not uncommon. We're seeing it again, but we're also seeing the impact of construction on the floodplain and things of that nature. So, we do get floods, but unfortunately we also get property loss and sometimes loss of life because people are where they shouldn't be.
Now, why is construction being allowed on floodplains? It seems like a no-brainer.
It certainly seems that way, doesn't it? But, one of the things I'm thinking is that you have a municipality. They're the ones that get to decide what gets constructed, where and how, and they have this big lure there of increased property tax base and things of that nature. And to be honest with you, they're really not the ones holding the bag afterward. When the flood comes and the damage comes, these municipalities then are able to go to the respective province, get disaster assistance. That province then goes to the federal government through the disaster financial assistance arrangements. And so, it's great. You can make this decision to allow a subdivision to be built, let's say, for example, reap the benefits of that, take in the taxpayer money, and then when it hits the fan later on, you're not the one that has to pay for the damage. So there's a bit of a problem there. We call that moral hazard, and I think the moral hazard is high here.
Now, here in parts of Ottawa and across the Ottawa River in Gatineau, you're talking about low-lying communities, certainly communities that are obviously close to the river, but ones that have been there for a long time for the most part. How could this have been prevented here in this region?
I mean, we've been using land use planning to manage flood for about 60 years now. This is not a new thing, and we've had an understanding of what a floodplain means and what it means to build on a floodplain for many years. And so, yeah, I mean, some of these communities are older. Conversely, I've seen some pictures of some fairly new, large, well-appointed homes also being affected by these events. We did kind of know back then what we know now, that building in floodplains is a dangerous thing, and floods, rivers flood. That's what they do. As I say, the boreal forest was designed to burn, and rivers are designed to flood. And we kind of know this. This is not a new thing. And so, we have made some planning errors in the past. There's no question about it. Are we going to have what it takes to reverse those bad mistakes and do things like perhaps buy people out that are at least at very high risk? These are the things I think we have to start really seriously talking about.
Now, at the same time, rainfall records have been falling this past week. We're not talking about normal flooding here. People use the term of it's a 100-year event. I'm not quite sure if we've reached that yet here in this region, but you get the picture. I mean, can municipalities really be expected to plan with this kind of scenario in mind, especially when, as you say, they started planning these things or at least thinking about them 60 years ago?
Well, I think, planning for a 100-year event is really the norm, and it's become the norm. I don't think we are at a 100-year event, as you noted. And unfortunately, what I find is that a lot of these rainstorms get really blown out of proportion at the beginning, and people start throwing around terms like 1 in 100, even 1 in 500, and then later the analysis shows that the storm was nowhere near that. So we kind of have a tendency to pump these things up a little bit, and we did that in southern Alberta after the floods in 2013. We talked about really exceptional rainfalls, and then when the analysis was done, it turns out the rainstorm was only about a 1 in less than 50-year event. So, yeah, I mean, we've been getting a lot of rain, but there's a confluence between that and melting snow and Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence is up very high, and so these things all conspired against us to create this flood. There's no question. But we did some very quick back-of-the-envelope analyses, and this rainstorm wasn't that exceptional. Yeah, we got a lot of rain, but it wasn't crazy rain, and it was spread out over a long period of time. But again, we kind of know what happens when it rains like this. We know where the water goes. We have a pretty good understanding of it, and I'll tell you, I always hear really the politicians say this was just too big. We couldn't do anything about it. You will never hear an engineer say that or an emergency manager say that. You'll only hear it from the politicians. Nothing is ever too big. We can handle this, and we have the knowledge, and we kind of knew this was going to happen. It happens every once in a while.
So then why would those politicians, why would municipalities allow building in those areas that are prone to flooding?
Again, it gets back to that moral hazard. The upside risk is greater than the downside risk, and I think until we find a way of either making municipalities hold some of the risk, or having others like the province decide what gets built where and when, we're gonna repeat this over and over and over again.
And the upside is what? In increasing your tax base?
Increasing your tax base is one. Making your electorate very happy is another. Sometimes in communities we have density objectives that we have to reach. So, let's build, and worry about the fallout later on.
So are there practical ways to discourage this?
I'm sure there are. And as I've been talking to a few folks, I'm not really familiar with any great models where we've changed things and made municipalities kind of, responsible financially and fiduciary responsible for some of these decisions they're making. But we do have to find a way of doing it. And it seems to me that with every natural disaster we get in Canada, the solution's always the other guy's problem. But I think all levels of government have to get together and start talking about this. We have to get the insurance industry involved in the discussion, private property owners, and we have to figure out a solution to this. And the problem, or the solution rather, is everybody's problem. It's not just one group.
Yeah. At the same time, it's awkward, isn't it? Because, I mean, you want to show these people sympathy and not say, well, it's your fault for building on a floodplain, or it's the municipality's fault for allowing you to build on a floodplain.
Absolutely. And I really hate to sound cold-hearted here. My heart really goes out to these people. It really, really does. But we need some tough love here, I think, and we have to look at things like the buyouts that took place in the Toronto area after Hurricane Hazel in 1954. We bought people out. We turned the neighborhoods into parkland, and now those parks flood. They did last week, as a matter of fact, and no property is lost and nobody dies. And this is the type of thing we have to do. And the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, they had some major flooding there last Thanksgiving. They came out right off the bat and said, we're buying out 18 high-risk homes and we're bulldozing them. And so that is in process. And these are the types of things we applaud. They're not easy decisions. You don't get pat on the back with these decisions, but something's got to give. Something has to change. And when these things happen, all Canadians pay for it.
Yeah. Glenn, we're out of time. Thank you for this perspective, though.
Thank you.
Glenn McGillivray is the Managing Director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction.